If you've been fighting with your mixes for years and they just aren't sounding right, or you're brand new and you don't know anything about mixing, this video is for you. This is the last video you're ever gonna have to watch about mixing. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna look at a visual representation of mixing. I know for me, visual comparisons help quite a bit. We're gonna go over all the rules and guidelines to mixing, the 5 golden rules that'll enable you to smash a mix every time, and anything else you're ever gonna need to know to create a banging mix, and most importantly, what not to do when you're mixing. If you're a fan of this video, I just dropped a complete and comprehensive 30-day course on how to produce electronic music. I firmly believe it's the best deal online. It's 99 bucks, but for my subscribers, it's half off. There's a discount code underneath. It's over 17 hours of content over 30 days. It's gonna teach you everything you're ever gonna need to know to produce industry quality music. And if you're not happy with it, it's fully refundable. That link's in the description if you're interested. Let's get into the video. So this is a very big topic. It's one that a lot of people have a lot of anxiety and fear around. I know for me, for many years in early production, this mixing is something that I really struggled with. And so I remember throughout my time at Icon, the one thing I struggled with is mixing. What my in particular issue for myself was for a long time is I was over processing everything in an attempt to do all these crazy mix moves, and it was actually making my track worse. And so today, all these years later and all these failed mixes later, one of the biggest lessons I've learned is if it's daunting and it scares you and you don't want to approach a mix, it's preventing you from mixing your tracks, you're probably doing something wrong, because mixing in and of itself is actually very simple. So we're going to go through all that, and first we're going to talk a little bit about like an overview of mixing, and then we're going to actually go in and mix a track together. So let's start with kind of like a basic visual of mixing. So we are in this room right now. We're in a living room, let's call it. And this might be metaphorically what our mix looks like when we're entering a mix down. So the problems we have here are the elements are not in the right spots. Sometimes they're slightly off. They're not the right sizes in comparison to each other. So we just moved into this house and each of these elements represents something in our tracks. So we wouldn't want our lamp on the floor. We have like 2 couches on top of each other. Our bass is overlapping our vocals. Our perks are above our kick. It's just all messed up. What we want to do is we want to have an aesthetically pleasing room with everything placed in the proper position and everything the proper size. So we just organized. Our kick is sitting in front of our bass, so we can hear our kick, but we can still hear and see our bass. Our vocals have their own space. Our snare's sitting in the right spot, and our perks and our synth are all sitting in the right spot. So it's aesthetically pleasing. So that's kind of what we're after when we're mixing. I know for me, visual stuff helps quite a bit. And so this is a very practical way to think about it. So this is my personal 5 biggest rules when entering a mix. Rule number 0 is mixing starts in the production phase. So this is a very, very big thing to think about, is when you're putting together a track, you're piecing together a puzzle. So if we pick the wrong elements to start with, we can do all the EQing, all the side chaining, all the imaging we want. If they're not the right elements, then they're just never going to really sit super good in our mix. Another metaphor for that would be if we pick a kick that is too big or doesn't work with our bass, it's just not going to work. If we pick the wrong snare and it's covering our perks, it's not going to work. So we need to pick the elements properly and the elements with the proper frequencies in order to be able to obtain a good mix. So rule number 1 is mixing should primarily be volume leveling, in parentheses, in relation to each other. So we've picked the elements that are proper. We have the kick that works right with the bass. We have a synth that's taking up the right amount of room. Everything's already we've already kind of pieced our room together good. The biggest part about mixing is getting the volume levels right in relation to each other. So that's 80% of your mix right there, is getting the volume levels correct. You guys have probably seen this meme on TikTok or Instagram when the hi-hat is louder than the 808 and it's Kevin Hart, who's way smaller than The Rock, whatever. And this kind of goes to show the problems this can create. It's aesthetically, like if our perks were huge and our sub bass was small, this is a problem we can easily fix with just volume leveling. So rule number 2 is use your ears. Every track, song, and mix is a little different. So I used to hate when people would tell me this when I was learning to mix. Like, how do I do this? How do I do that? Just use your ears. And it's funny and it's aggravating because it's very true. A big thing I've learned is the solo button is your enemy and the mute button is your best friend. So we want to hear how everything's working together. We're thinking of our mix as one unit when we're putting together. Our room is one room. So we want to kind of think of it that way and instead of like soloing and thinking of individual elements. So spectrums and numbers and metering is a great way to get a rough outline of how everything should be sitting. At the end of the day, though, it's really going to be based on what we hear. So there's like some mixes, like we've seen in ProQ, that although they have like some resonant peaks in the middle that doesn't necessarily look correct, for that particular track, they could be correct. So the main thing we're going for is We want it to sound good, obviously. And a big thing about this is you really need to separate yourself, your ego from the track. So you need to be able to listen to it objectively. And then also a huge thing is you need to take breaks, because if you're working on the same mix for hours and hours, your vision is skewed and you're going to start making some poor decisions. Rule number 3 would be, unlike mastering, mixing is part of the creative process and can be subjective. So your mix might sound completely different from someone else's mix. Like my cousin produces like boom bap hip hop beats. He's been in the game for a long time. And he's like my go-to person to get mixed opinions on, and I'm kind of his. One area where we always butt heads is like he'll send me something and be like, the 808's too loud. And then I'll send him something and it'll be like, it's not loud enough. And that's just different aesthetics. It's different genres, it's different styles, it's different taste. So mixing the volume levels and where everything's placed, the guidelines we're going to use of where everything should generally sit. But at a certain point, it is subjective. So it's based on how you want your mix to sound. Maybe you want your 808 to take up the whole track and take up all that room and be super louder than everything else. Maybe you want your synth to like be way louder than everything else. So that part it can really be subjective. So here's an example of that is maybe we want, our kick and our bass to take up the entire room. Maybe this would be like my cousin's mix is all bass and kick. Everything still has its own space. The sizes of everything or the volume levels of everything are different than how I would typically want mine. But it's still a good mix. Everything still has its own place. It's just a little bit different than I probably would mix mine or how I would lay out my living room. Rule number 4 is less is more. Do not get caught up. So I'm a strong component of over-processing and over-mixing something is worse than not mixing something at all. Again, surgical. We want to think surgical. So we want to make a bunch of little moves that are going to add up and give us a better mix as opposed to over-processing everything and ending up with just lost and not able to find our way back, basically. So less is more, do not get caught up. So micro adjustments, not over-processing and doing what we need to. Rule number 5 is take breaks. Ear fatigue is a real thing. Get other opinions, listen to it objectively. A good rule of thumb is 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 45 on, 15 off, something like that. Your hearing will start to get tampered after a while, and that's why we've probably seen the memes of like up all night working on a mix, now it sounds worse. That's a real thing. So you need to take breaks when you're mixing. You need to get other people's opinions, and then you need to listen to it objectively. So what I like to do for my stuff is I'll mix something, and then I'll like listen to it on the train or something the next day, and I'll try to pretend like I'm just hearing it, and it's just like a random track on SoundCloud. And I detach my ego from it and all the work I put in mixing to it and listen to it objectively, so as if I'm not attached to it. And that also gives me a better reading of like, okay, if this was just a random track, would I be super critical? Because for a lot of us, we tend to be very critical about our own work. It might be fine. A lot of the times I've been like cranking on a mix super long and then I'll send it to someone. They're like, dude, it's fine. You're tripping. So that's a big thing is listen to it objectively. So this is stuff we've already gone over, but using spatial effects to contribute towards your mix. So again, if we want to make something louder, bring it more up front, we're going to use saturation, distortion, overdrive. If we want something more quiet, we're going to push it out. So we're going to dampen the tops. We're going to turn down the volume, and then we're going to introduce spatial effects, so reverb, delay, echo. So this is stuff that, aside from stylistically, we're going to implement in our mixing to get a quality mix. And so another thing is there's a lot of pictures of like, oh, this is how you should mix, and it has everything set in like a very specific spot, like put tom 2 here, 50% to the right. These are good guidelines, but this is really up to you. Typically, yeah, you do want your higher percussive elements kind of towards the back and pound at more. You want your kick and your bass and your vocals and your snare kind of up in the front. And with that being said, those are good guidelines, but like you can really kind of make this your own. And that's the thing that's cool about mixing is you can make these decisions on where you want your own stuff. There's not necessarily like a way that it has to be done. And then again, using stereo imaging to contribute towards your mix. For like the widest elements, it's going to be the effects, top end, percussion, air, and then a little bit more narrow is secondary elements. So like toms, backing vocals, second synths. And then the mids, so like the snare, vocals, lead, synth are a lot closer up front and a little panned. And then in the middle, we have the low frequencies. So lowest, loudest in mono. So another thing to think about when imaging is panning versus wide. We want pads to be wide. We want atmospheres to be wide. Think of what things would be wide in nature. So if there was like an atmosphere, so like a space or like a whatever, that's going to be very spread wide. As to where something we would pan would be like hi-hats or percussive elements, because they wouldn't be spread wide naturally. They would be like pushed off to the side. So hats, percussive elements, sounds that are not wide in nature, that's when we would pan. So sounds that are high in frequency spectrum but are not meant to be spread. Percussive elements, hats, toms, all that stuff. So mid-side imaging refers to widening a sound while removing or not preserving the middle frequencies. So if you want to make room for the stuff in the middle, you can switch the utility to mid-side mode. And instead of spreading something, it's going to push it out to the side. So this is a good way to push elements that are not wide in nature to both sides. So we can push like really whatever we want in this fashion, and then it's clearing out all that room for our mid-range elements. So our kick, our bass, our vocals. So that's a really good trick as well. It's similar to the Haas effect. So this kind of circles back to EQing, which we've already covered, but knowing where to cut and how much. So this is super important. I fought with this for a long time, but we want to cut before we get loss of character and right when it's clashing with something. So that's a very finite spot of like, we don't want to reduce the character of the sound, but we want to cut the frequencies that are causing us issues. So here's an example of where overlap might be okay. So we have our sub and our vocals, and we can see there we have one formant. So we have that one peak right here that's totally clashing. This is something we would want to address because we have formants, which are the dominant frequencies, so the loudest frequencies, in exactly the same spot. So this is something we would address with EQing because these are in the way. So I wasn't really sure for a long time where overlap ended and was fine and where it wasn't. And to kind of summarize, we're looking for formants that are clashing, not necessarily this kind of overlap right here. And so next, as far as sidechain compression goes, we're basically moving stuff. And this would be a good example of that, is like everything's in the right spot. It's set, it's laid out. And so sidechaining our kick to our bass would look something like this. The bass would momentarily get smaller for the kick, so the kick could come in and take up more space. The vocals, the perks, the snare will kind of push to the side. And then as soon as the kick is done playing, everything goes back to normal size. So that's kind of a visual representation of sidechain compression, if that's helpful to anyone. So a 5-step mixing formula would be 1, choosing elements that have their own purpose and aren't overly conflicting. 2, get each track or group volume levels consistent. 3, getting the volume levels right in relation to everything else. 4, EQing, sidechaining, and using stereo imaging to give everything space. And 5, spatial effects. So this is pretty consistent with kind of what we just went over. And now we're going to utilize this 5-step formula to mix a track.